Welcome to Finding Medina, Episode 5, The March on Goliad. I'm Brandon Seale. Have you heard of Don Bernardo Gutiérrez de Lara? A colleague from Monterrey asked me one day. I thought he was joking. Why in the world was this employee of mine, actually, asking me about the commander-in-chief of the Republican Army of the North, the man who almost single-handedly carried the torch of Father Miguel Hidalgo's revolt in the north of Mexico through the winter of 1811 and 1812, the man who had traipsed halfway across the North American continent in search of allies and supplies to fight for a cause that appeared for all intents and purposes to have been crushed, and the man who was the central character of my upcoming podcast. I mean, I make no secret of my historical projects when I'm working on them, and everyone I've shared a meal with in the last year knew that I was working on the Battle of Medina. But I don't typically bore regular people with names and dates and details of these projects. I save that for you, my dear podcast listeners. Anyway, I eventually learned that when my colleague, Sergio Robles Gil Gutierrez, had asked me his question, he had no idea that his great-great-granduncle, Bernardo Gutiérrez de Lara, had any connection to the Battle of Medina. He simply had a faint idea that his ancestor had been involved in some sort of trouble in Texas around this time. After I responded enthusiastically to Sergio's question, yes, I have heard of Bernardo Gutiérrez de Lara, and oh my God, you're related to this guy, Sergio then shared with me copies of some of his personal documents, which I'll link to on the Rivard Report webpage for this episode. In many English-language accounts of the events covered in this series, Gutiérrez de Lara is like a silent extra in the background, a piece of the scenery almost. When you read his memoirs, diaries, and proclamations, however, Gutiérrez de Lara comes to life. He was as potent and capable a revolutionary leader as any of the other heroes of Mexican independence, more so, I would argue, than many of the more famous ones. He could touch men's souls with his rhetoric and inspire them with his charisma, and he possessed a unique ability to transcend borders and move between worlds, from his own sleepy hometown on the Rio Grande to the turmoil of a Revolutionary Army camp, to Native American villages in East Texas, to the backwoods of Louisiana, to the diplomatic salons of Washington, D.C. Everywhere he went, he seemed to win over allies. Recall that Gutiérrez de Lara had gotten his start as a propagandist for Father Miguel Hidalgo in the Rio Grande Valley. Father Hidalgo eventually recognized Gutiérrez de Lara's effectiveness by commissioning him his emissary to the United States, and Gutiérrez de Lara's words remained his most potent weapon. To Americans, he adapted his rhetoric to sound almost like Patrick Henry. Here's a quote from him addressing his volunteers, quote, "You will show your enemies and the enemies of liberty in every part of the world that the spark which lighted the flame of independence in the northern parts of America is not extinct in the bosom of the descendants of those who fought." End quote. To Tejanos, he sounded like Father Hidalgo, charging his message with grievance and imperatives. Escucha, desperta, abre los ojos, toma de ejemplo de la patriótica ciudad de San Fernando de Béjar. If you've previously heard of the events covered in this season of the podcast, you probably learned of them as the Magee-Gutierrez or Gutierrez-Magee expedition. I dislike this name for several reasons. First, Gutierrez de Lara's, and really more accurately, Texas's uprising in 1812 and 1813 wasn't an expedition. It was a revolutionary groundswell, a tidal wave emanating out of central Mexico through Texas, breaking onto American shores, receding back into Mexico to regain strength before surging forward once again. Second, the man with whom Gutierrez de Lara shares billing in our 7th grade history textbooks, Augustus Magee, actually died 4 months into the campaign, and no one seemed to notice. Indeed, Magee may even have been poisoned by the American volunteers that he was supposedly in command of. To give Magee equal billing with Gutierrez de Lara is to severely undersell Gutierrez de Lara's role in bringing about these events. Gutierrez de Lara had been planning this since 1811, lining up diplomatic support and resources of his own initiative, and in many cases, out of his own pocket. And in truth, even English-language primary accounts from the period very clearly characterized Gutiérrez de Lara as the unifying figure of the movement. And everything about Gutiérrez de Lara's career after these events as well suggests that he was a natural leader. His contemporaries, like Texas Royalist Governor Manuel Salcedo, certainly recognized his leadership abilities. As Gutiérrez de Lara's army marched towards San Antonio in September and October of 1812, men from throughout Texas flocked to his banner. By the time his army reached the Guadalupe River, the Republican Army of the North had swollen to 800 men. Tejanos were openly deserting from Royalist militia units and even the regular Spanish army to join Gutiérrez de Lara. To Governor Salcedo's horror, the flames of Father Hidalgo's revolt were burning bright all around him once again. He decided that he had no choice but to march out himself to quench them. Alberto Musquiz towed his Cessna 182 out from his T-hanger while I pushed on the wing strut. We hopped into the cabin, went through our pre-flight checklist, ran her up, and taxied into position along the freshly paved runways of Stinson Airport, the second oldest municipal airport in the United States, in fact. 100 years before Stinson began operations, Alberto's ancestor, Ramon Musquiz, had perhaps camped on this field in August of 1813 on his way to participate in the Battle of Medina as one of San Antonio Colonel Miguel Menchaca's wing commanders. Alberto and I have been friends for 20 years or so. We've bonded over the years primarily over two shared fascinations: the Texas-Mexico border and aviation. Alberto's family has been in northern Coahuila and South Texas for centuries now. In addition to a wing commander in the Republican Army of the North, the Musquiz clan has produced department chiefs of Texas, Coahuilan vice governors, and even an early Mexican president. When I needed a wingman to go up with me to do some scouting for Battle of Medina locations, I could think of no one better than Alberto. We went up on an overcast June morning, which spared us some of the heat that the sun-baked participants in the Battle of Medina had had to endure. We set a heading toward the Medina River, where we crossed over a lovely rolling little hay farm just before sighting El Carmen Church. From there, we flew south toward the site that we believed General Arredondo had occupied the night before the battle. I had only told Alberto in the broadest terms what I was doing in searching for the battlefield, without bothering to give him the details of the various accounts. Still, as we cruised along at 2,500 feet, Alberto was acutely attuned to the changes in topography, albeit for a different reason. "There's a couple of hills," he said, pointing ahead into the Encinal de Medina. "Where?" I asked him, struggling to make out meaningful landmarks in the thick oaks of the Encinal. "Do you see the cell towers?" he asked me. "They place cell towers on the highest points." What had jumped out to Alberto as a hazard for piloting the airplane immediately recalled to me one of the Republican descriptions of their ambush site, which I'll repeat here. Quote, "We formed the battle line, leaving a clear forest to our backs. On our right was located a large hill, at whose back there was an impenetrable forest that entirely protected us from being flanked on that side. On our left, there was another large hill, more considerable and difficult than the one on the right. In front, we had a plain extending for a mile, which was then followed by a thick encinal in an extremely sandy soil through which passed the road to Laredo." End quote. Looking down from the high-winged Cessna, I analyzed Alberto's hills with this description in mind. Though they didn't really form a canyon in the traditional sense of the word, they would have had a decided funneling effect on any army marching between them before spitting them out into the relatively more open plain just north of the Encinal. And winding its way through the middle of those hills, depressed about 50 to 100 feet beneath the elevation on either side, ran modern-day Campbellton Road, right where Bruce Moses said the Laredo Road had been. What was missing, however, from this otherwise promising site was a stream. Although the other accounts don't mention it, recall that William McLean's 1861 account quite clearly says that the night before the battle, the Republicans camped along a stream, quote, 4 or 5 miles southwest of the Medina River, end quote. Now, there is a stream about 4 or 5 miles southwest of the Medina River, only it isn't on Bruce Moses' Laredo Road, the road that Arredondo was approaching on. It lies, more or less, on Bruce Moses' Lower Presidio Road, the other major road coming up into San Antonio in 1813. The stream that the Lower Presidio Road crosses, incidentally, is Las Gallinas Creek, the creek that we think Arredondo camped on the night before the battle, albeit about 6 or so miles downstream. In older times, Las Gallinas Creek, or parts of it anyway, were known as the Charcos de Gallinas. A charco in Spanish means a puddle or like a small pond. It's a reference in this case to the stream's tendency to hold water in spots. And even on that hot and dry June day when Alberto and I overflew it, the impoundment tanks along Las Gallinas Creek still held water, even as water tables had dropped significantly in the region in recent decades. There is, incidentally, a battle account that I haven't talked about yet that specifically mentions the Charcos de Gallinas. Antonio Menchaca, one of the premier statesmen of the later Republic of Texas, was a 13-year-old boy at the time of the battle. Antonio Menchaca was also the cousin of Miguel Menchaca, the commander of the Tejano units at the Battle of Medina. For Antonio Menchaca, the Battle of Medina wasn't some distant event. It was family history. Antonio Menchaca described the movements of the Republicans and Royalists on the day before the battle as follows, slightly abridged. Quote, "The Republicans crossed the Medina River, and on a hill, a short distance the other side, they thought a convenient place to take the enemy at a disadvantage. Arredondo, also coming to a place that he considered advantageous to his purpose, stopped at the water holes called Charcos de las Gallinas, on the hill this side of the Las Gallinas Creek, and about 5 miles from the Medina River." End quote. We actually have a problem here. The Charcos de Gallinas, 5 miles southwest of the Medina River, can't be both McLean's Republican campsite and Menchaca's Royalist campsite. And you know what the Charcos de Gallinas actually looks like from the air? A little canyon that would have made a pretty decent Republican ambush site. In fact, the hills rise almost 100 feet on either side of the creek, which runs parallel to modern-day Old Pleasanton Road today. Many students of the battle, in fact, have identified this spot as the likely ambush site. So maybe this means we've labeled the Laredo Road incorrectly. Several contributors to this podcast, most notably Fred Martinez and the mysterious Joseph Baer, have pointed out that the road that I have been calling the Laredo Road was actually just one of the Laredo roads. They point out that another, parallel road, joining up to the Lower Presidio Road, also served as the road to Laredo at different times. And then, as I was writing this, the mysterious Joseph Baer, whom I discussed in a postscript to episode 3, and whose work I've been publishing on our webpage, came forward once again to blow my mind with another alternative. What if, instead of starting the morning on an eastern Laredo road, Arredondo had started on a more westerly Laredo trail, from which he deviated eastward to head back toward the area of El Carmen Church and that lovely little hay farm that we had flown over? Another listener, Michael Olivares, has actually suggested something similar to this as well, I should note. And there's nothing that we can point to definitively refute this theory. How in the world were we going to run to ground all these different possibilities? At a certain point, attempting to reconcile all of the ambiguities in the various 200-year-old accounts becomes impossible. Changing landscapes, faulty memories, and the fog of war can play tricks on people's minds. Were the Republicans or the Royalists camped on Las Gallinas Creek? Or did the battle start way up on the Medina River itself, as tradition long held, and as one of the more colorful and otherwise plausible accounts of the battle actually seems to suggest? And how far exactly did the Republicans pursue the Royalists after they sprung their ambush? One account says a half mile, another says 2 to 3 miles, another still says 4 miles. It's a kind of range that makes a mockery of our attempts at precisely identifying old roadways. In piling estimates upon estimates, we're actually compounding our imprecision, not reducing it. You have to take your victories where you can find them. At this point in the project, I felt pretty good about our approximation of the opening position of Arredondo's Royalist Army. And we had now, following our overflight, identified the most likely canyons in which the Republicans could have set their ambush. Even if we were still unclear as to which of the two roads the respective armies had been on, it did feel like we were at least narrowing down the universe of options. Once we had wrapped up our scouting exercise, we pointed Alberto's Cessna towards Stinson Field and flew back the way we came, over El Carmen Church, the Medina River, and that lovely little hay farm. We landed and taxied back to Alberto's tea hangar. As Alberto and I were packing up our headsets and folding up our sectional charts, Alberto paused for a moment and turned to me. 3,000 men marching around in the middle of the monte, and you mean to tell me that none of them had a map? He asked. He wasn't the first to have brought this up. Rob Lakowitz from our research team had been pretty vocal about this too. There had to have been a contemporary map, either from before or right after the battle, he insisted. After all, it wasn't a secret to contemporaries where this battle took place. Up until 1822, in fact, the bones of the dead still lined the road. Thereafter, a marker commemorating the dead hung on an old oak or pecan tree, depending on your source. Someone had to have put this on a map somewhere. Well, it turns out that Alberto and Rob were right. Someone had put it on a map. And not just anyone. One of the most famous Texans of all times was actually one of the most prolific map makers of early Texas. In episode 1 of this season, and indeed for much of the first season of this podcast, we studied what drove Tejanos to take up arms against Spain in 1811, 12, and 13. But what was it that motivated Gutiérrez de Lara's American volunteers to go fight for the independence of a foreign country? U.S. government agents in Louisiana at the time certainly hyped their role in recruiting men to enlist in Gutiérrez de Lara's army. Their goal was to undermine Spain's position on the continent and to prevent Napoleonic France from stepping into a Texas power vacuum. But we shouldn't overplay the role of U.S. agents either. They were never actually as in control as they made themselves out to be in their letters back to Washington, D.C., something which has certainly contributed to the misperception of these events as an expedition from Louisiana rather than as a revolution in Texas. In truth, official U.S. government support of Gutiérrez de Lara was lukewarm at best. Recall that the United States in 1812 was about to go to war with her old imperial master and could ill afford to open a second front with Spain on its southwestern border. But before we go deeper into the motivations of the individuals that crossed the Sabine and volunteered for Gutiérrez de Lara's army, we need to ask ourselves, what should we even call these volunteers? Tejanos at the time called them Anglo-Americanos, a term which entered Texas English as Anglos. These volunteers might not have appreciated that term, however, given that their old homes were about to be attacked by England, and given that many of them were, apparently, Irish, for which reason Gutiérrez de Lara chose a solid green banner as the battle flag of the Republican Army of the North. Later Mexican sources would call these men Norteamericanos, but North America means different things to different people, and so is again imprecise. And so we're left with the admittedly imperfect term Americans, which is indeed what Gutiérrez de Lara's volunteers called themselves, though it should be noted that most Mexicans, then as now, also consider themselves to be Americans, inhabiting as they do the American continent. For all its problems, Americans is probably the least confusing term, however, so we'll stick with it. Of course, complicating things a little further, a fair number of Gutiérrez de Lara's Americans were, in truth, Frenchmen, holdovers from a decade prior when Louisiana had been French. They had long been joined to Tejanos by bonds of family and trade. Many of Gutiérrez's actual Americans came from families that had followed the steady advance of the frontier over the previous generation, from New England through Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Missouri, and Tennessee. In their working lives, they were printers, doctors, lawyers, and farm boys tired of tilling the soil. There was at least one slave in their ranks, named Thomas. A few of the men were actual veterans of the American Revolution. But all of them, in some way, shape, or form, were heirs to the ideology of 1776. And they believed unquestioningly in the right of revolt, particularly against distant European masters. One of these American volunteers described his comrades' motivations in this order. Quote, "Their first desire seems to have been to escape the sleuths of justice back at home. Next, the love of adventure. And third, the prospect of establishing a new republic." End quote. Recall, this was a time of worldwide tumult, of revolutions, and of nation creation, and these men wanted to be a part of that. Gutiérrez de Lara spoke generously of his American volunteers. He described them in various places as, quote, "valiant, brave, free, and independent," and as veterans, hardened to work in the strains of military life, and supremely accurate and skilled marksmen, end quotes. As products of the frontier, just like their Tejano comrades in arms, these volunteers' toughness was unquestionable, and their idealism was more than likely genuine, but so too was their opportunism. Specifically, these 1812 American volunteers, indeed all of the men in the Republican Army of the North, were fighting for the promise of $40 a month and a square league of land, 4,428 acres each. But I don't think this should surprise us. Why else do people pick up roots and go settle in foreign lands? An 1832 immigrant to Texas perhaps summed it up best. Quote, "You may ask why we leave the United States of America for that of the United States of Mexico. In answer, I can only say that it was through choice, with a view of bettering my fortune." End quote. In a way, these volunteers from across the Sabine looked a lot like the Tejano contingent that had formed the core of Gutiérrez de Lara's army. The Tejanos in the Republican Army came from a similarly broad swath of their society. Historian Raúl Ramos has cross-referenced the names of known San Antonio supporters of Gutiérrez de Lara with contemporary housing records to reveal that 3/4 of the Republicans lived in jacales, or hide-covered shacks, a proportion that corresponds almost exactly to the at-large home ownership patterns of the community. This data suggests rather broad-based support for the Republican movement and some sort of ideological alignment across much of the San Antonio community. And chief among the shared grievances of Tejanos in 1813 were royal restrictions on trade with their American neighbors and the Crown's refusal to free up land, causes that seemed like they were almost tailor-made to fire up early 1800s Americans. Americans certainly saw the advantages of freer trade with Texas, which they had gotten a taste of when the short-lived De las Casas government briefly removed trade restrictions in 1811. And land was inextricably linked with liberty in Americans' ideology of the day. Land guaranteed a man an income, freed him from interference from others, and absolved him of the need to grovel at the feet of feudal or bureaucratic superiors. Texas, of course, had land in abundance, yet in the 300 years of Spanish rule over Texas, the Crown would release less than 15% of Texas's lands to its citizens. Last, but certainly not least, what unified Tejanos, Native Americans, and Anglo-Americans was Gutiérrez de Lara himself. His presence in front of all three groups is the most tangible thing that they had in common. I'll say it again here. The evidence is clear that Gutiérrez de Lara was an enigmatic, charismatic leader. And let me say this too, he's also a badass. As best I can tell, the legend of Gutiérrez de Lara being a blacksmith may actually come from the fact that during the upcoming siege of La Bahia, he set up and worked a forge repairing his men's arms himself, while still being present at all points in the action. Earlier, on his journey to Washington, D.C., he learned that Spanish assassins had been hired to ambush him on the Natchez Trace. He got the drop on them first, however, recording elliptically in his diary that, quote, "I did not carry my arms to play with," end quote. And in future battles, we'll see him leading from the front, placing himself in the heat of the action. People follow leaders like that. They like to be led by leaders like that. American volunteer James Gaines would conclude his account of this great drama with a brief but poignant postscript, almost as if it were the only concrete conclusion that he could really draw from the entire episode. And I'll say it the way he spelled it. Quote, "Gutierrez was a good patriot," end quote. Gutiérrez de Lara did something really remarkable between 1811 and 1813. He built a multi-ethnic Tejano, Native American, and Anglo-American volunteer army and launched it against one of the most powerful empires on earth. And he had won their first contest near Nacogdoches in the previous episode on September 18th, 1812. By October 16th, Gutiérrez de Lara's Republican army had marched west across the Colorado River, where recruits had swollen their ranks to over 800 men. Spanish Royalist Governor Manuel Salcedo could no longer ignore the growing threat, and so mustered what forces he could to meet the Republican army himself. He sent forth spies to follow Gutiérrez de Lara's advance, and laid a trap for him where the Nacogdoches-San Antonio Road crossed the Guadalupe River. But Gutiérrez de Lara wasn't heading to San Antonio. He had decided to march on La Bahia, better known today as Goliad, on the next Finding Medina. Thank you for listening. And thank you to everyone who has reached out or left comments on our Rivard Report webpage. Also, please go to iTunes or Stitcher and leave a review of this podcast, because if everyone who listened to this series left a review, it would launch these important historical events to the top of the charts. Editing for this episode was performed by Susana Canseco, sound engineering by Stephen Bennett. A special thanks to my friend George Gaitan for letting us use his music on this series. You can find out more about him at georgegaitan.tripod.com. Thanks to my SWCA environmental research buddies, Crystal Allgood, Rob Lakowitz, and Zachary Overfield, as well as to San Antonio City archaeologist Kay Hines. Thanks to Brian Stauffer, our unofficial Old Spanish document transcriber, to Samantha Alanis, our cartographer-in-chief, to Cesar Gutierrez, our unofficial Archivo General de la Nación researcher, and to UTSA's Dean of Libraries, Dean Hendricks, our unofficial all-other document finder. And a special thanks to Alberto Musquiz, this podcast pilot in command. For more information about our podcast and other projects, you can check out www.brandonseale.com.